Alright, so we start with the external obliques. They cover a large area of the abdominal muscles, so it's kind of handy to get them first. On top of that, there will only come later the Rectus Abdominis, which is the main six-pack muscle. There's actually a couple layers underneath the external obliques, but since we don't see them, we're not really too concerned. They probably have some influence on the shape, but not in a dramatic way, so I'll mention them anyway though. So the lowest layer would be the transverse abdominis, and then we also have the internal abdominal obliques. So the internal obliques also run diagonally but upwards, an upward angle, so orthogonal to the external obliques. And the external obliques, they originate from the ribs 5 to 12, and they insert in the iliac crest and pubic tubercle. So iliac crest, just a part of the pelvis. There's a part called the ilium, and the crest is just the border part, I guess. And then we have the pubic tubercle, also the ending part of the pubic bone. So next we have the pectoralis minor muscle, and that's a really important one because it has actually, although it's not visible, it lies below the pectoralis major, but it has definitely an impact on the shape, and it gives that mass or bump on the outside close to the deltoid. So that gives it a really distinct look that you can see, especially with very muscular individuals, bodybuilders and athletes. So very important to know that. And the origin of that is the ribs 3 to 5, and it will attach to the carozoid process of the scapula. The carozoid, if I pronounce it correctly, process is a part that looks kind of like a hook. There are a couple of muscles attaching to there, and pectoralis minor being one of them. That's all you need to know for now. So, if we move on to the pectoralis major, that's a cool muscle. We have 3 parts, and they cross each other. So, if we look here, we have the upper portion attaching to the clavicle, the clavicular part, and it runs down. It inserts in the humerus, the upper arm bone. It's the lowest insertion of all the muscle fibers from the pectoralis major. So if we move on to the sternal portion, that's attached to the sternum, and then it inserts slightly above the clavicular part. And then if we move down, the lowest part, attaching to the costal cartilage part of the rib cage, that's kind of flexible, so you can breathe and you can expand and all that good stuff. This, the lowest part, attaches the highest on the humerus, so that gives a certain shape to it, where you can see, again, more well-developed chest muscles, where you can see how the muscles are overlapping each other, and the lowest part running the highest. And that's really important to know to get it looking realistic, and that's probably the number one thing, maybe. Not sure if the number one, but that's one thing that I see wrong a lot of times. That the chest muscle people sculpt just doesn't add up. You can tell, it's impossible that the lowest portion of the chest muscle really runs up and has a straight way making to the humerus. So keep that in mind, and that's it for the pectoralis major. So if we move to the back now, and I will start with the spinal erectors, or erector spinae. They have 3 parts, iliocostalis, longissimus and spinalis, but the last one, spinalis, is not really visible, so we can leave that out. These muscles are kind of complex in a way that they have lots of insertions and origin points. So I won't really go into detail because, quite frankly, it doesn't really matter too much, because at the end they have really two distinct shapes that they form and that you can easily identify. So if you're aware of them, then that should be enough. So these two are the Longissimus. So all you need to know is, in my opinion, they partly originate in the sacrum, part of the sacrum, and then they run up towards the temporal bone, so towards the skull. But all you see really is the lower part, the lower portion, the lower back here. And then the iliocostalis muscle comes and overlaps it, and they form a larger shape, a larger muscle covering that. So the iliocostalis has again multiple origin points, but the ones maybe are most important, again the iliac crest, and then all the ribs. So it's coming from the sides, as you can see on the images here, and then it overlaps the longissimus muscle and creates this distinct shape that you can see here. So next we have the Serratus Anterior muscle, also called the boxer's muscle, because it's engaged when you throw a punch. Function of the Serratus Anterior is to protect the scapula, and the origin is the 1st to 8th rib, and then it inserts the medial border of the scapula. Medial in Latin meaning to the middle, so towards the middle of the center of the body. And interesting thing is, it's most noticeable from the front. Has this really distinct finger-like shapes, especially for very lean individuals. But then it's also very noticeable in the back, even though it's covered by the Latissimus dorsi. The serratus actually has quite a bit of mass, and so it bulges out the back muscles at this part, and quite essential to know to sculpt a realistic back, I would say. Okay, next we move on to the Teres Major and Infraspinatus, both attached to originate in the scapula, and they insert at the humerus. The Infraspinatus a bit higher than the Teres Major. And at this point I'd like to talk a bit about the scapula, because it's a very important bone, really. A lot of muscles attached to it. It's responsible for a lot of movement. For example, the biceps, triceps, they both attach to the scapula, and depending on the rotation and elevation of the arm, you will have a different position and rotation of the scapula. So the scapula is just attached by the clavicle, so medially it can freely move across the rib cage, and it will, when the arm is raised, it will rotate outwards. So why is this important? Because, let's say now for the Teres Major and Infraspinatus, depending on how you have your arm, so if you have your scapula retracted or protracted, that will cause a different position of the scapula, and therefore it will push against the Teres Major or Infraspinatus muscle, and they will look quite different from pose to pose. So that's actually quite a tricky thing about the back muscles to get right, because there's so many different poses that you can have, especially when your arms are in different position, that it gets really unclear why the muscle is in a certain shape. But once you're aware of, first have to figure out how's the scapula positioned, how is it rotated depending on your pose. And then actually it makes sense, because in some poses, for example, if we have a protraction, so let's say a punch, the serratus anterior is engaged, then you have your scapula protracted, Now the Teres Major, for example, is very thin and it's stretched out. But if you had the scapula retracted, your arms pushed backwards, then suddenly the scapula pushes against the Teres Major and it gets bulged out and appears very large in shape. And I think that can be kind of tricky sometimes to make sense of, because in some poses the infraspinatus appears large, for example in a protracted position, and then if you have the opposite, then suddenly the infraspinatus appears rather small, but the Teres Major appears large. Alright, so next you have the lats, or Latissimus dorsi, and Latissimus is actually the biggest upper body muscle, but it's actually quite thin, so it's almost like a sheet and it's covering all these other almost all these other muscles, except the trapezius and only partly the infraspinatus maybe. But as far as the origin is concerned, there are 4 parts. Vertebral part, so that's the vertebrae T7 to T12, and so T7 stands for thoracic, and so the spine has 3, or maybe you could say 4 parts. So you have first the cerebral vertebrae, so that's 7 in total. Next, if you move down, you have the thoracic vertebrae, that's 12, and then you have 5 more, the lumbar vertebrae, and then you have to that attaching the sacrum. They actually all represent part of a curve, so if you look at the curvature of the spine, every change in direction you have a new kind of vertebrae. And so yeah, that's T7 to T12, meaning the 7th thoracic vertebrae. So that's the vertebral part. Then it attaches also to the iliac part, so part of the iliac crest, and then it has a costal part, so it's attaching to a couple of ribs, rib 9 to 12. The lowest we have 12, and then last we have the scapular part. So it's just attaching to the lowest, to just a tiny bit of the scapula there. And then it inserts all the humerus, and it kind of gets this bit of a twist at the end. So yeah, it just wraps around everything and then it inserts at the humerus. Okay, if we take a look at the rhomboids now, this muscle is almost not visible. It's still part of the superficial back muscles. I included them here, but it should be only visible for very lean individuals in some poses. Nothing to be concerned for this tutorial though. Anyway, I'll talk quickly about the function. So it's helping the scapula retract. It helps pull up or shrug the shoulders, and also reverse, push the shoulders down. So that's what it does. And its origin is T2 to T5, and you should know that now. So that's thoracic vertebrae, so pretty much upper middle part of the spine, and it inserts in the medial border of the scapula, which makes sense if you think about the function that I just talked about. So that's pretty much all I would like to talk about it for now. Alright, now we have the trapezius. Trapezius is a large muscle also, and it's broken down to 3 parts. Descending, transverse, and ascending. So let's start with the descending part. We have the origin in what's called the superior nuchal line. That's part of a bone, also of the occipital bone. There's another attachment, another origin is the external occipital protuberance. just remember the back of the head. It's running down, and then we have our cervical vertebrae, the first or the top 7 vertebrae of the spine, and there's the nuchal or nuchal ligament that's attaching. It's a fascia, has tendons, and there we have also muscle originating, and then it all inserts in the lateral third of the clavicle. Lateral meaning to the side, so that makes it clear, I think, where on the clavicle it's attaching, but you can see on the pictures also. Next we have the transverse part. Transverse part, it's attaching again a kind of a fascia, this kind of fibrous sheet that's attaching again to the vertebrae, T1 to T4, and then it all inserts at the acromion and the spine of the scapula. So the function of for the descending part was movement of the head, rotating the head up, down, to the side, and then the transverse part, the function is basically just retracting the scapula or protracting also. So well, not so much protracting, actually only retracting, pulling the scapula together. The muscle can just shorten, right? So next we have the ascending part left, and the ascending part, we have our origin in the vertebrae T5 to T12, and then it all inserts in the medial end of the spine of the scapula. And the function of the ascending part is to lower and also to move the scapula to the middle and lower it. Okay, now we got the Rectus Abdominis, so basically our six-pack muscle, and it's originating from the crest of the pubis, part of the pelvis, the pubis, and then it's inserting the xiphoid process of the sternum. So that's basically like a tip. The sternum is sometimes called, so the middle part of the sternum is called gladiolus, or it used to be called that way, or it's still, I don't know. But gladiolus, so that's the sword, the Roman sword, because basically the thing looks like a sword. You have the manubrium, the upper part, where the clavicle attaches to, and then, so that's kind of the grip, I guess, and then you have the blade, and then the xiphoid process is the sharp tip, so maybe that helps you remember it. Anyway, so that's the insertion, and I think that's all I can think of right now. Next we have the Sternocleidomastoid. Sternocleidomastoid. Amazing name for an amazing muscle. It's originating. It actually has two heads though. One head is originating at the manubrium. Remember, the manubrium is the handle of the Roman sword, the gladius. And then there is also the clavicular head. So the clavicular head is attaching to the clavicle. And it's all then inserting in the mastoid process. of the temporal bone. So you can see it on a picture. It's this sharp protrusion, and then it's also attaching to the nuchal line of the occipital bone. Remember, that was where we have descending part of the trapezius originating also. Not exactly the spot, but part of this nuchal line. So the function of this muscle is rotation of the neck and more head movement, extension, flexion. Okay, so lastly we have our platysma, and that's a muscle that's kind of unique because it's originating in fascia but also skin, so it's very superficial. It's originating below the clavicle on the upper chest region, and then runs across the clavicle, goes above the sternocleidomastoid, and then it inserts in the mandible, the cheek region, and also lower lips and area around the mouth. So it's responsible for facial expressions, for example. So if you pull the corners of your mouth sideways or downwards for some facial expressions, the platysma is involved in that. So that will round out everything and should cover all the important superficial muscles that we need to sculpt a nice torso. Alright, now that we got all our individual muscles, I will start blending in everything together, because I mean, we don't want a skinned person or an ecorche. We want kind of a realistic looking result. So I would suggest to keep your ecorche though, because it might be interesting to look back and just see if everything you're doing now adds up. And yeah, it's kind of a cool tool just to study and go back to from time to time, I guess. But what I will do now is I will just, for areas where I feel like there's something to explain and there's some information that would be helpful, I blend in some text and put up some pictures that will show what I'm saying. So that will be the rest of the video. I hope you enjoy it, and thanks for watching. And if you like the video, then drop a like, and I'd appreciate a sub, of course. Yeah, hope you have a great day.